Well, we are talking with Mike Licona, who is one of the top apologetics experts in the United States and also heads up the apologetics area at the North American Mission Board. We're talking about Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament scholar and has really hit it big in the last few years on the New York Times bestseller list with some of his books. And one of his books is described on his website, and it says that it makes the case that the Bible is riddled with inconsistencies and outright forgeries. And Mike, one of the things that Ehrman argues is that there are a lot of contradictions in the Gospels, and therefore we can't really tell if it's true or if it's not. Especially, he kind of zeroes in on the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. What are some of the contradictions that he sees in that account?
Well, for example, he'll start off and he'll say, was Jesus crucified on the day of the Passover meal or the day after the Passover meal? Mm-hmm. The latter being what the synoptics say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the former being what John said. And he says, depends which gospel you read. Was Jesus crucified at 9 a.m. or at noon? Did he carry his cross all the way, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke say? Or no, part of the way, and then Simon of Cyrene carried it, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Or did he carry it all the way, like John says? The two thieves between whom he was crucified, did both curse him or just one? And for that he says, depends which gospel you read. When it comes to the resurrection, he says, how many women went to the tomb? Was it just one? Was it just Mary, like John says? Or was it multiple women, like the synoptics say? And when they got there, did they see one angel or two angels? And when the angels told him he had been raised and to go tell the disciples, well, did they? Like some of the Gospels say, or did they go away and say nothing to no one, as Mark says? And when Jesus first appeared to his disciples, was it in Jerusalem or Galilee? And was it all in one day, the resurrection, all the appearances in the ascension, like Luke says? Or was it over a period of time, like the rest of the Gospels seem to imply? So he says, it depends which gospel you read. So those are the kind of contradictions that he brings up.
Now, other scholars are certainly aware of these apparent contradictions as well. How much significance do they give these kinds of things?
Well, it depends. When you're talking about biblical scholars or New Testament scholars, if they're skeptical, then they put a lot on them. A lot of them will put a lot on them. Like they'll say they're hopelessly contradictory, is what some like to say. But when we're talking about professional historians who have been trained in the philosophy of history and historical method, those outside the community of biblical scholars who deal with non-religious issues, then contradictions are expected. Because there are different vantage points in which people look at, some of them are just perceived. Authors are being select with the things that they talk about. I mean, I could give you lots of examples, but they don't see these as major problems. And some, like A.N. Sherwin White and some others, have expressed surprise and shock at how biblical scholars are far more critical about things than professional historians would be. And that's because, again, biblical scholars typically don't study philosophy of history, historical method, and they are usually more attuned to the views, the myopic views of their particular skeptical subculture.
Right.
And it's those that make a big issue out of the contradictions, the purported contradictions. But typically professional historians don't make a big deal out of them, especially if they're in the peripheral details.
Well, what about within New Testament biblical scholars? Would the majority of them dismiss the Gospels because of contradictions like Ehrman has brought up, or are the majority of them willing to look past those?
A lot of them are willing to look past them. Ehrman himself is, because despite his hesitations toward the Gospels that he articulates, and I shared with you that he says, he still says that one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of Pontius Pilate. So the same thing with the appearances. He still believes that the disciples had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus who appeared to them. So they're pretty much red herrings. They're meant to take people off track. But at the end, he grants a lot of the same things that a historian would in terms of what we can know.
Back to historians whom you say are a lot more comfortable and, I guess, used to contradictions like this in their work. Are there, in other historical cases of events that are pretty well documented, Are there even similar contradictions there that eyewitnesses saw things differently or left things out or included things that contradict with each other?
A real simple case would be the sinking of the Titanic. Now that's within the last 100 years.
Right.
Eyewitnesses, survivors who were there, who watched it go down. Some said that she broke in two, and then she sank. And others said, no, the Titanic went down intact. Now,
wow, that's a pretty big difference.
yeah, I mean, if you're there, this is the most frightful night of your life. You're out in the middle of the ocean. The water is extremely cold. You are watching loved ones and friends die before your very eyes. You're hoping you're not going to die. You're watching the ship go down. You're in a heightened state of awareness. You're not tired. I mean, you are, but your mind is really focused, and you're watching it. And some said she broke in two prior to sinking. Others said, no, she went down and sank. How do you mess that up? But they did.
Wow,
but in spite of that, no one concluded that the Titanic didn't sink.
Right.
So in terms of peripheral detail, we could say, yeah, we don't know that, whether she broke in two. I mean, we found out when we discovered in the 1980s when the Titanic was discovered. And then they found, yeah, it did break in two prior to sinking, but we didn't know for sure until then. So that's just a more recent example. There are others in antiquity I could give too. But
well, back to the Bible, as a believer and someone who believes that every word of the Bible is true, I'm not really even comfortable hearing about some of the contradictions that you just mentioned. You know, that was a pretty long list of contradictions. How, Mike, do you explain, why would those happen?
Okay.
Is there a pretty good explanation for a lot of them?
For a lot of them, sure. Some of them are more easily explained than others, of course.
Yeah.
So, for example, did Jesus carry his cross all the way? As John said, well, John doesn't really say that he carried his cross all the way. I mean, you're left with that picture, but he could have simply omitted the carrying of the cross by Simon of Cyrene. That wouldn't be any big deal. It's one of those peripheral details, and he might have just left that out. Whether there was one or two angels at the tomb or how many women went to the tomb, if you read John real carefully, the first two verses of chapter 20, the resurrection chapter, John says, Mary went to the tomb, saw it empty, ran back, and told the disciples, they've taken our Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. We? Who's we?
Yeah.
We find a similar thing in Luke, where Luke says that when the women came back, Peter ran to the tomb. But then a few verses later, when the Emmaus disciples are talking to Jesus, they don't recognize him at that point. They're saying, yeah, and the women came back and said the tomb was empty, and then a bunch of our own went out to the tomb to check it out. Well, whoa, wait, you just a few verses earlier said it was just Peter. Well, it didn't say just Peter. You just focused and said it was Peter. So it's not a contradiction in that sense. And like with the appearances in Jerusalem, Luke is using a very common rhetorical or literary device called time compression or telescoping, where we can imagine one of those telescopes with the different segments and you collapse it down.
Right.
And what Luke is doing for purposes of economy, things that you and I do every day in our conversation, everybody does this in our conversations. We collapse them down for purposes to make it quick. And so Luke collapses everything, the resurrection, the appearances, the ascension, all on Easter. But it's obvious that Luke knows that it occurred over a period of time, because in his sequel in Acts, the very first chapter, he says that Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 days prior to his ascension. So there's no contradiction when you look at it that way. Now again, some are more easily resolved than others. Some aren't so easy to resolve. But I'd also like to point out, even though I am a biblical inerrantist, that even if some of these were irreconcilable, all that would do would call into question some form, a wooden form of biblical inerrancy. It wouldn't say that the Gospels are not trustworthy. I mean, you wouldn't throw out any other book. Ehrman himself contradicts himself in his book on a couple of occasions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't believe everything he says. I mean, he brings up about the Syriac traditions about Judas, Didymus Thomas, in other words, Thomas being a twin. He says, why not believe this? Well, but then another part, he says, well, the reason we don't believe these is because these are late if we want to know anything about the real Jesus, you got to go to the New Testament Gospels. This is not for theological reasons, he says. It's for historical reasons, pure and simple. Well, Bart Ehrman said both of those. So he contradicts himself, and that doesn't mean we throw out everything he says.
Yeah. Well, Mike, we've been talking today about Bart Ehrman, but there are a lot of critics and folks out there who are shooting holes in the Christian faith, or trying to every day. What's some of your advice for believers who want to maybe equip themselves and just better know the arguments so that they can push back against some of these criticisms of the Bible and the New Testament?
Well, there are a lot of great resources out there. We've created a website, fortruth.net. It's the number 4, not F-O-U-R, but the actual numeral 4, truth.net. And we have over 150 articles on there. My first debate with Ehrman is there in its entirety. People can watch that for free. A number of my debates are on there, but we've got interviews with leading scholars and scientists on there. It's translated in 5 different languages we have on there, so it's a great resource. I'd also recommend for people just getting started, you have Lee Strobel's resources. So he's got The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for a Creator, The Case for the Real Jesus. He's got those in small group discussion with DVDs and participants guides. These are really great resources. Those are great starting points. You can get into more in-depth things, such as, I've got a book out. It's a self-study course on the resurrection, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, that comes with software, and Gary Habermas and I co-authored that. There's a lot of good books out there.
Yeah.
A lot of good resources, and anyone interested in following up with these, well, the website would be a great place to start, but just great resources to help people out there.
And as the popularity of Ehrman's book attests, people really are interested in who Jesus was and the New Testament. So Christians, if they can really equip themselves with this information, have an opportunity to share a lot with people.